Faith and Reason. So I hope you enjoyed the reading from Father Giussani on faith. I know it could be a little confusing, but I hope you get it. And so I want to talk about this topic of faith, and I want to break this up into 3 videos, right? And so I think it is important, first off, before we start talking about faith, to get one thing kind of clear. In like the etymology of the word, right, of faith, it comes from the Latin word fides, which also means trust, belief, confidence. So like when you use the words faith, belief, trust, confidence, all these things, etymologically they come from the same root, right? So like we kind of just employ them different grammatically. So I'll use these terms all synonymously because I think they essentially are all the same thing. They all mean the same thing. We just employ them to kind of make grammatical sense. If you disagree with that, feel free to send me an email or set up a Zoom thing because, that can be pretty important. Because what I want to do is I want to kind of take these basic ideas of Father Giussani and I want to kind of draw them out to see what we mean about faith in God. Because, when we're talking about faith in God, I said that a lot of people seem to think we're talking about this idea of like a belief without evidence. But what Father Giussani just talked about, like when we're talking about having faith in people in everyday lives, that's not what we mean at all. So what I want to do is I want to take this idea of faith as we use it in our normal life and then see if we can apply that to God. So for those of you who are just like, yeah, look, I get what you're saying about faith, but it all changes when we start talking about faith in Jesus or faith in God, that's fine. I just want to really kind of dive deep into this idea of the word faith and how we mean it on a normal, human, secular, everyday level. And once we kind of establish that and hopefully can all agree on that, I then want to see if we can apply it to God and why not. And if we can't, then just get rid of it. And if we can, then embrace it and kind of show how it can move us to that next step with God. So the first thing, and Father Giussani kind of hits on this is one of the main points of the section we read, is that faith brings about real knowledge, right? So it's not an opinion, it's not a probability, but rather my faith brings up knowledge, right? And it's reasonable to accept this knowledge, right? Because it's knowledge through a witness. So it's knowledge that I don't have from my normal ways, because the normal ways that I get knowledge is I see something directly, I experience it directly, and I get knowledge that way. Faith is when I get knowledge through a witness, and that witness experienced a thing directly. So Father Giussani uses that talk about him on the airplane where he meets his old friend from high school, and she tells him about another friend of theirs from high school who was crazy, but he's gotten his life together and he's like working well, he's got a family, he's doing really good. And she tells him all this stuff, and because he believes her, he gets that knowledge. So he can talk about his friend in high school who was crazy but is now normal. He can talk about him as if he saw it himself. But he didn't. She saw it, and because he trusts her, he has faith in her, he gets that knowledge as well. Kind of like an example that I like to use to demonstrate this. I don't know if I've used this in Faith and Reason class, so I'm sorry if I have. But so, for instance, I used to live in Italy at the Vatican, right? And so in the Vatican, in St. Peter's Basilica, in the very back, there is a giant bronze chair, a statue of a bronze chair, and it's called the Chair of St. Peter. Right now, rumor has it that there's bits of an actual chair that St. Peter used to use in that statue. But there's this big statue of a chair with these like 4 church fathers holding up the chair. It's a very beautiful statue, and it's like sitting on this it's kind of like embedded into a wall. Now, what's interesting, and not many people know this, is if directly behind this wall that the statue is on, literally directly underneath the chair, is a bathroom. There is a single person, little teeny bathroom with nothing but like a little toilet and a little sink directly under the chair. And so a lot of guys would joke that like under the throne of St. Peter is another kind of throne. Now, the only way you can access this bathroom is if you can get all the way to the back of the Vatican, where people aren't usually allowed, and go behind the wall, behind the altar, and then like embedded in the wall, there's a little door that opens up to that bathroom. Now, I was once lucky enough that I was teaching some elementary school kids while I lived in Italy, and we got it where they could have their first communion at the Vatican at that at that altar. And so while we were preparing for their first communion, I was like, I've heard rumors of this, and so I'm going to go check it out. And so I walked behind the wall in the altar, and there it was. There was the throne beneath the throne, right? Like there was this little bathroom. It's real. I saw it with my own eyes, and I can attest to you that right now in Italy, in Rome, there's a bathroom at the back of the Vatican that very few people know about. Now, the interesting thing about this, right? It's either true or false. There either is a bathroom or there's not. There's not a bathroom for me, but not a bathroom for you. Like that doesn't make sense. There either is a bathroom or there's not a bathroom, right? So if there is, and you know there is, then you know a fact. You have knowledge, right? If there isn't and you think there is, that's a fiction. It's false. You don't have knowledge. I am telling you that there is a bathroom there. And so what's interesting is, if you trust me, if you have faith in me in this regard, you now know something, that there is a bathroom at the back of the Vatican underneath the throne of St. Peter, right? What that says, I don't know. What that means, I don't know. But you know that fact now, right? So that if someone asks you, you can be like, yeah, there's a bathroom back there. Like if you're ever in the Vatican and you're about to go to the bathroom in your pants or something, you can just be like, there's one back there, just run. The guards might stop you, but you can make it. You now have this fact, but you've never seen it. I've seen it. I am the witness, and I'm telling you it's there. And so what's interesting is you know this now, but through me. You know it through me. So it's real knowledge, right? And it seems to me reasonable, right? I think anybody would argue it's reasonable to have this knowledge. It's not irrational for you to say, oh, I trust him. But rather you'd say, well, I know him. I know he lived there. He's trustworthy. He's never lied. You know, he's a really good person. You might say all those things. You might not say all those things. But if you trusted me, you might say all those things. You might say that, like, I trust him. I surrender to his knowledge, right? And sometimes it's very practical to do so, right? Like, so for instance, if I'm driving home and I see a wreck on the interstate and there's a ton of traffic, I might call my wife and say, like, hey, don't come home through the interstate because there's a ton of traffic, right? Go around, go back roads. You know, it would be weird. It would be like irrational if my wife said, I got to see it to believe it. You know, and if she's just like, I'm going to get in that traffic because I can't trust anybody. I just have to know directly myself. No, like sometimes it's the more reasonable thing to trust, right? So if she knew that I wouldn't lie to her, if she knew that I'm capable of kind of analyzing basic traffic forms, she might say, there is a wreck on the, she might even turn to everybody at her work and say, hey, there's a wreck on the interstate. Don't go 75 south, right? And she would present it as a fact as if she saw it herself, though it's through my witness, right? So all of this is a very basic concept, but it's really important, and it's going to be super important when we apply to see whether or not this idea works with God. But what's just interesting here is it becomes an extension of my reason, right? So I think that's an important thing I kind of want to talk about here. So faith or trust brings about a real knowledge. The next thing is, you know, you can have something that kind of contradicts our knowledge, it goes against our knowledge, or it can extend it. So something can go against our nature, or it can extend our nature. An example of this would be like your eyes, right? You see with your eyes, and you can see a reasonable distance with your eyes. You know, like at night, you can see like some stars, you can see the moon, you know, your eye can see. Now, some things conflict with that, right? So if I threw dirt in your eyes, that conflicts with your sight, right? Like it immediately makes you stop being able to see. It's anti-sight, right? Like dirt in that sense becomes anti-sight, anti the nature of your eyes. But some things actually extend the ability of your eyes, right? So a telescope, for instance, right? Like I can see, like I remember there was once, I think it was Saturn. I could be wrong there, right? So this is a moment where my witness becomes a little unreliable, right? Because I don't fully remember. I think it was Saturn. That like you could, like I read like an article saying you can see Saturn tonight in the night sky. And so I went outside and they were like, you know, that little dot, this from this direction from the moon, that's Saturn, right? But it just looked like this little teeny blip that it might have like been twinkling a little different color than the other stars. But, it's like, that's Saturn. And then I remember we had a telescope at my house that, it was my stepbrother's. I had never used it, but it was upstairs still. So I remember, I ran up. I was at my mom's house. I ran up, and I grabbed the telescope, and I set it up, and I looked, and it was, amazing, because, all of a sudden, not only could I see Saturn, but I could see, a faint outline. This was a pretty cheap telescope. faint outline of a ring, and then I could see some moons, right? Like I could see these little dots around it. And so it was crazy that like through this telescope, my ability to see was extended, right? It was like not like with dirt that contradicted it, but rather what I could see with my naked eye is now extended to where I could see moons and a little outline of a ring. Like it was kind of like mind blowing, right? Like I really enjoyed looking through this telescope. I had never looked through a telescope before. And so that was a moment where the ability of my eyes was extended, not kind of like, not frustrated, not violated, but the telescope extended it. True faith, like faith that brings about true knowledge. So a witness who is being honest, I would say, extends our knowledge. And that's why it's not irrational. It's not against reason. Rather, it's fully in line with reason. It extends your reason. For whatever reason, you might not be able to know something at a moment, right? So Aristotle talks about how every time you learn, anytime you have a teacher and they teach you things, it always has to begin in trust. So like, for instance, if you're in Mr. McMahon's physics class and you really enjoy it and you feel like you've learned a lot, that began with you trusting him, right? It began with, this man knows this. I'm going to open up my mind to his mind and receive his knowledge. And then I will grow in that. And then I will eventually be able to check that myself, right? So like, it's interesting, you begin by, learning through trust, and then you see it yourself. And so you no longer know through faith, you know it for yourself. But most of the time we learn, it begins in faith. And for like someone like me, like y'all know very well, I don't know a lot of physics. I'm not very good at physics. But what happens is a lot of times we'll have a dialogue going in class and we'll get a debate going, and y'all will say something from physics and it kind of confuses me, blows my mind. So what I do is I run to Mr. McMahon later that day and I ask him like, hey, like someone said this, is this true? And then he'll often say like yes or no. And then if he says, yeah, that is true, then I would say that if I trust him, then I've learned something. Now, I could go off and study various physics textbooks. I could go get a physics degree and run various experiments and then verify all this information for myself. But that would seem to be a lot of time and dedication, and it would mean, quitting my job to go back to school and leaving my family. And it would seem not very practical. Whereas McMahon has dedicated his life to this. He has gotten a degree in this. He studies it. He seems to love it. Y'all all seem to trust him. So it seems to be this perfect moment where I could go off and do all of this work myself, which would be very impractical and arguably irrational for who I would have to abandon to do it. Or I could say, he knows this, and through his knowledge, I can gain some knowledge. And so, this is all very basic. It's 12 minutes and 30 seconds so far of something very basic. But the point just so far, and once again, we'll apply this to God later, but at least for right now, whenever we say, I trust somebody, I have confidence in somebody, I know something through faith, I know something in faith, we are dealing with a real knowledge. And in these everyday circumstances, it's not irrational. It's not like, oh, I'm rational all day, and then when I trust my wife when she says there's traffic, I become irrational. No, I would say that actually extends my reason beyond its normal scope. Right? Like if I tell you there's a bathroom in St. Peter's, like it would be impractical for you to fly all the way there and then risk getting in trouble with the guards to go check that. Rather, you can trust me and it extends your knowledge and saves you a plane ride, right? And risking coronavirus. So this is a moment where faith is proven to bring about real factual knowledge. Not fictions, not opinions. Because opinions are where you're like, ooh, I don't know, it could be this way, I think it's this way, but it could be that way. It's not probability where you're like, there's probably a bathroom there. I'm telling you there is, and if you trust me, you know there is. So, today's lesson, faith brings knowledge. So, if there's any issues with that, feel free to shoot an email. I'll probably do some Zoom office hours sometime soon so we can talk about it if you have an issue. But I hope that helps. God bless.